Good afternoon, everybody. This is Congressman Mike Levin. Thank you, as always, for joining us for another virtual town hall. We've been doing these now for the last few months, and I'm very grateful for our entire team for helping to put them together, along with our wonderful video conferencing folks. We're glad you're here, whether you're on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or on our website. And I hope this is an informative 90 minutes where we're going to talk about a lot of things happening in our country and in our district right now. It's been a very difficult week for the American people. And normally we've been focusing these town halls on COVID-19, and we'll be talking quite a bit about COVID. But the last few days have been really challenging and really disheartening as we have navigated not only the public health crisis, not only the economic crisis, but we're seeing people throughout the country speak out and confront racial inequality and systematic injustice that still permeates our society. We're in crisis right now. Our country is broken by generations of systemic racial injustice, and it's clear that only real change will allow us to begin healing. The protests in response to the killing of George Floyd are a necessary part of that process, and I stand with peaceful demonstrators all across the country. I don't support the small minority of people who have taken advantage of the situation to commit violent or criminal acts, and we won't allow them to define the overwhelmingly peaceful nature of these protests. That aside, I'm going to fight for real reform at every level of government, whether it be federal, state, or local, to address the racial injustice throughout our society, particularly in the criminal justice system. We need new laws to strengthen transparency and accountability in law enforcement. We need to ban unnecessary and excessive uses of force, including chokeholds, and we need to end the militarization of local police departments. As we work towards real reforms, we also need to acknowledge that the vast majority of police officers are honorable people, fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, our neighbors, who risk their lives to keep our communities safe. As we saw with the recent comments from the San Diego police chief and his decision to ban the use of a chokehold by his officers, as well as the recent statements from the Police Officers Research Association of California, our peace officers can and must be a part of the solution. And moving forward, I'll use my office to whatever extent possible to bring our law enforcement and our civil rights communities together for constructive dialogue of the path forward. Finally, we need leadership at the White House. The words and actions of this president have divided our country and are pulling us backward. Instead of directing federal law enforcement to fire rubber bullets and deploy tear gas on peaceful protesters for a photo op, we need someone in the White House who will listen and try to understand the pain that Americans are feeling right now. So what are we doing in Congress about all this? Well, today I'm announcing that I'm co-sponsoring the Eric Garner Excessive Use of Force Prevention Act, introduced by my friend, Representative Hakeem Jeffries, to amend civil rights law to prohibit the use of chokeholds by law enforcement across the nation. Second, I'm co-sponsoring the Bipartisan Commission on the Social Status of Black Men and Boys Act, which was introduced by Representative Frederica Whitfield. The bill establishes a bipartisan commission within the United States Commission on Civil Rights Office, tasked with examining the social disparities that disproportionately affect Black men and boys in America. Third, I strongly support the effort of House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler to hold hearings on additional new federal actions that could help reduce acts of violence by law enforcement against Black Americans, as well as the committee's plan on a federal chokehold ban. As I mentioned, I also support the City of San Diego decision to ban the use of carotid restraints, a type of chokehold, as a use of force procedure in their department. And finally, as we continue to develop solutions and strategies, I encourage our constituents to call our office and contact our office with their priorities and their opinions, their concerns, their questions. You can do so by visiting our website at mikelevin.house.gov, or you can call our office at 760-599-5000. My great hope is that in the days ahead, our community stays safe and that we use this opportunity to whatever extent possible to create a new normal. And I hope we can do so with compassion rather than aggression. Now let's turn to COVID. Very sadly, our country passed the 106,000 mark of those who lost their lives from the coronavirus. We're all shaken by that statistic, and we're all prayerful for the families that have been impacted by this. It's a heartbreaking tragedy for our nation. Currently, the United States has the most confirmed cases of coronavirus in the world by far, with approximately 1.84 million, and as I said, over 106,000 deaths. California has confirmed 117,000 and counting cases and over 4,300 deaths. San Diego County has confirmed 7,674 cases and 276 deaths. And Orange County has confirmed 6,574 cases and 150 deaths. However, I would mention that over the last 14 days, Orange County actually had more cases and deaths than San Diego County. Orange County had 2,074 cases and 62 deaths. San Diego County, 1,648 cases and 54 deaths. And that's despite the fact that San Diego County has been consistently testing significantly more people than Orange County, and the relatively low rate of testing in Orange County continues to be a concern of mine. As I mentioned in our past virtual town halls, and if you watched any of these, you've heard this before, we have now passed a number of bipartisan bills relating to COVID-19. The first back at the beginning of March, $8 billion for the vaccine. I'm encouraged by everything I'm hearing and reading about development of that vaccine. The second, the Family's First bill in mid-March, $200 billion, which included a lot of money for emergency sick leave, for Medicaid reimbursement, and for nutrition assistance. Then the CARES Act towards the end of March, $2.2 trillion, $100 billion for our hospitals, $150 billion for our state and local governments, $31 billion for our education, both K through 12 and higher education, $20 billion for our veterans, and then, of course, significant sums in expanded unemployment insurance, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Account, which is being administered through the California EDD, the cash payments of $1,200, and, of course, the Paycheck Protection Program for small businesses, the first round of funding for $350 billion. Then, in addition, there was all the lending capacity from the Fed, another $500 billion there. And then later on, in April, we passed another $484 billion supplement to that bill, another $320 billion for the Paycheck Protection Act, which included $60 billion specifically set aside for community and smaller lenders like credit unions and community banks. In addition, another $75 billion for hospitals, and with an emphasis on Medicaid serving facilities such as community health centers, and $25 billion for testing, including a requirement that the administration provide a national testing strategy to the Congress by May 24th, which they did. Unfortunately, it was not a very comprehensive strategy, more like a very thin document that was focused more on self-promotion and on passing the buck to the states. So then we passed the HEROES Act now a couple of weeks ago, over $3 trillion, of which $1 trillion would go to state and local governments. This is so critically important because, as Councilmember Padilla or Mayor Blakespear can tell you, smaller cities, cities of under 500,000, were not included in the CARES Act. They received no direct funding for both the direct costs related to COVID-19 and, just as importantly, for any of the lost revenue. And we know from all the conversations that we've had that so many of our local cities have been dramatically impacted. Their transit occupancy taxes, their other taxes that they have not been able to collect because of this pandemic. The bill that we passed, the HEROES Act, would include over $300 million for our local cities in the 49th district. Sorry to Steve Padilla, because Chula Vista is not in the 49th district, but for Mayor Blakespear, good news that Encinitas obviously is. But all the cities were all for it, and their mayors, Republicans and Democrats alike, all joined and signed a letter to leadership, and that letter was impactful and effective because that made it into the final bill. There's a ton more in there for our first responders, our folks on the front lines of this, and it's not just the folks we might be thinking about conventionally as first responders, but also folks like our teachers who are so dramatically impacted by the lack of stable municipal finances as well. There's also $7.6 billion in direct funding for health centers, $25 billion to hopefully stabilize the United States Postal Service. Now, why is that so important? Well, I look at it through the lens of having a subcommittee gavel for the House Veterans Affairs Committee on Veterans Economic Opportunity, because over 100,000 veterans are employed at the United States Postal Service. We need to make sure we keep them at work, delivering our mail, doing that great work. We also have $100 billion in there for stabilization for low-income renters, and there's just much more. And look, I don't expect Mitch McConnell and the Senate to agree with every single word of an 1,800-page bill that's over $3 trillion. I didn't agree with every single word of an 1,800-page bill that's over $3 trillion. What I do expect them to do is take action. McConnell, at first, he said, well, let the states and the cities go bankrupt. That's unacceptable. Then he said we need to take a pause. But the pandemic is not taking a pause. The health crisis is not taking a pause. The economic crisis is not taking a pause. And the Senate should not be taking a pause either. So they need to take action. They need to come up with their own proposal. And then, as we have done historically in the Congress, including in the first 4 COVID-related bills, let's come to the table, let's work together, and let's get something done for the American people who are hurting during this time. One thing I try to do during all my town halls is share the number for the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And I encourage anyone in need to call or text that number, 1-800-799-SAFE. Again, that's 1-800-799-SAFE. And lastly, I want to encourage you, we have a coronavirus federal resource guide on our website at mikelevin.house.gov that our team put together. It's very comprehensive, and I encourage you to check it out. With that, I am pleased to welcome not 1, not 2, but 3 fantastic guests for our town hall this week. We have Councilmember Steve Padilla, Mayor Catherine Blakespear, and Dr. Karl Steinberg. And I'd like to start with Steve Padilla. Steve is a council member in the city of Chula Vista, and he's the chairman of the California Coastal Commission. And Steve, we actually had a great announcement recently regarding a $11.5 million federal grant to help stabilize the Del Mar Bluffs. I'm so grateful to partner with you and with Catherine and all our local stakeholders on protecting our coast throughout the district. But that actually isn't why I asked you to join the town hall today, because in addition to all the things you do as a strong leader in our region, you also recently battled a life and death case of COVID-19. And you and I talked about this, and you spoke so powerfully about it, but I thought it would make sense for you to share just a little bit about your experience dealing with COVID-19 with our viewers today. So Steve, take it away.
Well, thank you, Congressman, very much for having me. And first off, let me say I'm honored to be on such a distinguished panel. And boy, this is a good example of leadership on your part, bringing some folks together in this particular time. And I want to thank you for your voice and for your leadership, not just obviously within your district, but in doing things that really benefit all of us here in this region. I was just reflecting a moment ago as I think about sharing my own story. I am not just a COVID survivor who almost didn't survive. I'm a gay person of color who is a former law enforcement professional. And here we are on a panel talking about everything from COVID to the impacts of that to the times we're living in today. So in my experience with COVID, and I think all of our collective experience, it's exposed, frankly, in a very real and terrifying way, so many of the work that still needs to be done to deal with underinsured and uninsured folks in our country and in this state, people who lack access to good care, and the disproportionate impacts and the social inequities, frankly, that this situation has revealed. And so first off, I think in that vein, I want to just acknowledge this moment as well. I want to acknowledge the memory of George Floyd. I want to think about his family. I want to acknowledge the pain of our African-American brothers and sisters and people of color and indigenous peoples everywhere. I want to acknowledge that Black lives do matter. And I want to acknowledge that there are so many professional men and women in law enforcement of every color and background who every day conduct themselves with courage and professionalism to try to keep us safe. And I can tell you, as you referenced, Congressman, you know, some of the images we've seen more recently that show police chiefs and men and women in uniform literally holding hands with peaceful protesters and taking a knee, I have been moved to tears. And that tells me that the core of our community and our country is strong, our character is good, And when we come together, the overwhelming majority of us can move mountains. And it's happened before. We still have a lot of work to do and some uncomfortable conversations to have. But I just needed to acknowledge that as well. And thank you again, Mike, for your leadership. I'm a lucky, blessed dude, as I tell people. I am vertical, as they say, and ambulatory and walking around. And I think just on a personal level, first, I just would like to share with everyone that obviously, if you have had to contemplate your own mortality, if you come close to or being very critically ill, it truly does change you, and it has changed me. And I reflect and I meditate and I hope and pray every day that it's changed me in ways fundamentally that'll help me be a better human being and a better leader. I've never been that ill in my life, ever. As I said, I nearly did not come home. It makes one really reflect on what it all means, what our priorities need to be, and how if you kind of get a second shot at something, that perhaps you should try to make it mean something, even more so. And it's done that for me. What this has taught me in my own case is that there's still a lot we don't know about this virus that we should not forget and pay attention to. While we see nationally, I think a lot of the statistics deal with the mortality rate centering around older folks. We still know that there are many cases that we don't understand that affect really young children. One of the things that I really had to meditate and think about in my own case was thinking about all of those who didn't get to leave the hospital. And some of them and many of them were younger than me, certainly in better shape than I was before I got sick. I did, by the way, lose 30 pounds in about 2 weeks, and I'm happy for that silver lining, but it's not a weight loss program that I would recommend to anyone. But all I had to do was lay there. I did nothing. I lost 30 pounds. It's not a workout or a diet involved. But in my case, it's insidious in that obviously you can have no symptoms or little symptoms and still be contagious. You can be around people that you wouldn't think would be vulnerable and be exposed. There was literally about 1 week's time before the onset of my symptoms and the time that I was being placed in the intensive care unit and put on a mechanical ventilator and being intubated, literally one week to the day. As you mentioned, Congressman, I'm really honored to serve as the chair of the California Coastal Commission. So I was traveling up the coast to Santa Cruz to chair that hearing there, a 3-day hearing. I flew through the San Jose airport right before that hearing and had no clue at the time that I was apparently flying into the epicenter of the outbreak in the state of California. And I was flying within 48 hours of a period when a number of TSA, Transportation Security Administration officials at that very airport had all tested positive for COVID. I also later learned that just a few days prior to my leaving town, I went to a social gathering with a loose group of about 10 friends, and later found out that 50% of us all got exposed to coronavirus. So it was as if I was unintentionally trying to catch this. And I wasn't, whether it was being at the wrong party or flying through the wrong airport to the wrong county. But suffice to say, I arrived there on a Tuesday evening. I had hearings for 3 days. By Thursday afternoon, I started feeling as though I was coming down with a bad cold, with kind of a flu-like symptoms, a little bit of a runny nose, little body aches, other typical symptoms that progressively got worse. By Thursday after my hearing, I was feeling pretty bad and ended up sequestering myself in my hotel room, actually. And I didn't even attend the Friday morning hearing. And I told a colleague to take the hearing for me, flew back to San Diego because I obviously couldn't drive or walk. And that was still a packed flight. And, you're kind of leaning out the window of the aircraft if you can, practically, to try to stay away from everyone. But I came home, and within a matter of a few days, I was admitted to UCSD. And within 36 hours of that admission, I was put into the ICU on a ventilator. And what really helped me in my case was I had many typical flu symptoms, a high fever, the aches, but what my medical professional team were looking for were whether my oxygen saturation rates were healthy. And as I am well aware now, that normal range is between 95 and 100. And you'll understand if you've ever been to an ER or to a hospital, they put that little gadget on your finger and it gives an indication of how well you're oxygenating your blood, which carries that to all your vital organs. And on a second, I had 3 visits to the ER. The second visit, they advised that I go get one of those devices. And I did. Actually, my son-in-law did. And it was in monitoring that I realized that number was slowly dropping, even though some of my other symptoms were staying the same. And one of the scary things that I've learned about this virus is that many COVID patients can be oxygen deprived, and they're not displaying the typical symptoms that you would see in some cases. And it can be kind of scary, and you may not know it until it's too late. I started to see those numbers go south. As soon as I told my doctors that, they said, get your butt in here right now. And I was admitted to the hospital. And it was, not a fun experience, obviously, being critically ill. I was intubated. I was put on a mechanical ventilator for a period of time, was not breathing for myself. This ventilator was doing the breathing for me almost 100% for some period of time. I had a partial lung collapse. I had some seizing that they didn't quite understand. But at the end of the day, I was so lucky that I had a very confident, capable, and top flight medical professionals taking care of me, who intervened in a conservative and early way, because by the time apparently, and interestingly, I don't even have a memory of some of this. By the time they moved me to ICU, I was really laboring apparently to breathe, and every ounce of energy that my body had was going to just try to breathe, never mind fight a virus. And so the advantage, at least in my case, was that ventilation did that for me, and my body was able to clear the virus. I spent nearly 3 weeks in the hospital. I was on a ventilator for 11 days. As Mike and I were joking, I lost 30 pounds in about 2 weeks. That's, certainly a record in my life.
But not a good plan, as you said.
Not the right
Not a good plan.
There are better ones. When I returned home from the hospital nearly 2 months ago, nearly 8 weeks ago, I could barely walk. I had severe muscle wasting. I needed a little walker, and if I walked a few steps, I would be exhausted. And today I can tell you that I'm vertical and out and doing about 3.5 miles every day and trying to rebuild some strength. And just grateful for all of the thoughts and prayers and good karma that came my way. And I tell folks in my life and in my community and everywhere that one of the difficulties for COVID patients is the isolation, right? You're there literally in a negative pressure room. You're very isolated. You can't have family and friends come and hold your hand or talk to you or visit you. And although I was very isolated, I know that I was not alone. And I believe that had a great impact in my case. And my thoughts again turn to those that, for whatever reason, and in some cases it's inexplicable, weren't able to come rolling out of the hospital like I did. The night that they moved me from the ICU to my regular room, I remember, and you know how fast things move in hospitals, right, guys? They tell you, hey, a couple of guys are coming to get you. They're going to take you out of this ICU and they're going to put you in a regular room, and you're just so happy about that. They said they'll be right here to move you. Like 3 hours later, I'm laying there, waiting for the orderlies to come get me. I had plenty of time to look at CNN on the television monitor in my room, and they were telling the story of a New York surgeon who died in the arms of his partner because he went to work. And they were telling the story of a couple that were high school sweethearts, and he was a vice principal at a Catholic high school and coached football, and she played their wedding song to him on Zoom, basically, as he died, because he was on a ventilator and did not come home. And he was much younger than me. So my thoughts were to those folks, and all I could do, Mike, in that ICU that night was just lay there and weep. all I could do. And so suffice to say, we have work to do because I'm a blessed, lucky guy. I had great insurance. I had great health care. But I think what this crisis has revealed, and you well know, there are too many vulnerable populations in our society. There are, right here in San Diego County, people being disproportionately impacted, particularly people of color in some communities. And, my medical bills would probably give people a heart attack, but they're covered. There's some folks out there that won't seek medical help because they're worried about financial concerns. And I do think that we have to think about as a society and as leaders about being strategic with resources. We're still in some places still partially rationing testing here in this county. I don't know that we've been strategic in where we put resources to put into neighborhoods and communities that have higher rates of infection and illness and hospitalization. So overwhelmingly, if I don't see the inside of a hospital again for the rest of my life, I'm going to be real happy and grateful. But it has made me reflect, both as an individual and as a representative in the community. And it's taught me some things and made me reflect about some things. So we still have a lot to do. I'm just very blessed and lucky to be here. And I hope that in sharing my story, the whole point is this. This is still a real threat in our community. And as we march with righteous indignation about the inequalities in our society and injustices that we still have to confront, we have to still be our brother and sister's keeper. We still have to remember that we're in large groups, we're breathing on each other, we're forgetting our masks, and that we don't have a vaccine yet. We don't have good necessarily therapeutics yet. You could have a conversation with someone at a protest and they go home and talk to their grandma or their grandpa that may not survive. So I just think we just have to really care for one another, and we have to not lose sight of this threat. It's real. It's not a hoax. And we need to continue to listen to our medical professionals, and we need to act responsibly, in my view. So if my story helps remind anyone of that, then my experience, while very difficult, maybe will have some positive impacts. And again, Congressman, thank you for your leadership, and thank you for including me on this panel. And I'm really happy to be here and happy to
thank you, Steve. Thank you so much. I'm first and foremost, I'm so glad that you're doing well. And every week, as those who've watched these town halls know, we give the statistics of all the cases and everything else. But it's not just statistics. It's our friends, our loved ones, our colleagues, and just know that we have been thinking of you, will be thinking of you, and I'm just so happy. Not only are you doing well, but that also you can share that story, because you would be amazed, and my team who works on these town halls can tell you, and Dr. Steinberg can tell you, that we still get questions. Is this real? Isn't this just the flu? Isn't this all being overblown? And I always think of you, and I think of others that I know who were dramatically impacted by this and had just a real scare. And I'm just so grateful that you're here, and many years working together from here on out, my friend, on many good things for our community. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, next up is another good friend, Encinitas Mayor Catherine Blakespear, and she is a fourth-generation resident of Encinitas, elected to serve on the Encinitas City Council in 2014, became the second directly elected mayor of Encinitas in 2016, and was reelected in 2018, and also importantly is vice chair of the Sandag Board of Directors, which is, as far as I'm concerned, Mayor, an incredibly important post for all of North County. And in my opinion, you also write the best email newsletter of any local official. And it's just incredibly thoughtful, incredibly comprehensive. And I wanted you to come on just to share your perspective from Encinitas, and specifically how you've been impacted by all the recent crises facing our country. And I was just in Cardiff last night, where there was a few hundred very peaceful folks out there with a vigil for George Floyd and others in Cardiff at the Cardiff Kook. And it was just a great reminder of the great deal of compassion and togetherness in the community, specifically in Cardiff, but all throughout your great city and really throughout our district. So I'm grateful that you're here, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here today. Listening to Councilmember Padilla's story makes me really recommit to not getting coronavirus, because you hear what suffering there is. And it seems to me like everybody who ever hears a story like that would wear a facial covering in public and would want to protect their neighbors in case they're asymptomatic. So I'm grateful to you for including him in this, even though he's not in your district, and for convening us all to have this conversation today. So we're clearly in a defining moment right now, and it is because of many things that are roiling our community. So if you just step back a little bit and you think about a pandemic, this global pandemic, an economic collapse, racial violence, community unrest, they're really, these are all things that a mayor and anybody in an elected office and all sorts of people in our community are really wrestling with, trying to unravel where am I, how do I feel, and what can I do to help? And I think what's clear is that we see that minorities are dying from police brutality, from coronavirus, from systemic disinvestment, from poverty, from lack of health care, from environmental pollution. I mean, it's across the board at higher numbers than people who are not minorities. And this is incumbent upon all of us to work to change. So we see what's happening with the protests. And I think it's really important to remember that protesters are protesting, looters are looting, and they are not the same thing. So there are elements that are coming into protest that can distract from the message, but the legitimacy of the protests remains. And we have to keep focused on that and recognize that nobody supports looting. It's stealing from others, it's violent, it's a violent betrayal of their privacy and of something that they have built, especially these poor store owners who have built up their life savings, had it closed during a pandemic, just reopened, and now have their windows smashed and everything taken. It just is such a tragedy. We think, how is that possible? People are doing that. But just remember, protesting is separate, and peaceful protest is a really important part of change in this country and everywhere. So the question is, how are we turning all of that collective anger and that collective grieving into action? Because that is an energy that we need to be able to channel towards something. Will this allow us to make those broad and sweeping policy changes that will create a more just and equal society? And we have to answer that question with yes, that energy will lead to that. But I think what's clear to me is that the changes that are needed will be controversial, they'll be contested, and they will ask many of us, many white people, to make a different decision about things that we have made in the past or that have fallen one way instead of another way for a various weighing of values. So where are we investing when we're coming out of this pandemic? How are we building our built environment? I mean, the fact that minorities disproportionately are poor and we do not allow housing that is for people who have a lower income results in the built environment not accommodating people having places to live. That's a fundamental injustice, and it's a racial injustice. How are we funding our social safety net? And that the social safety net goes across healthcare and all childcare, it goes across everything. So these are things that we have to grapple with. And police brutality is something that is critically important as well. We know that African Americans are 3 times as likely to die at the hands of law enforcement than somebody who is white, and that's a real injustice. So finding out what we can do, I think, is where can we focus? That's that next step. And I think for me, I am hopeful. I always remain hopeful because I see what we've done in this country. From starting the foundation of this country being based on slavery, we passed the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment. It was after a civil war, but it abolished slavery, it ensured equal protection, and it enshrined voting rights. We then in the 1960s passed the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, and we elected an African-American president. So we have this within us. We can find our better angels. We need to be able to create the epic changes that are as profound as we've done in previous generations. And so awakening and having the urgency that we see from our constituents is the thing that's going to make us able to move forward. But it is going to be hard. And that's the part that I think is important for all of us to be grappling with is, what are the specific concrete changes? How do we go from the aspirational from the status quo to the aspirational? Politics and policy is right in that very small band of that sacred activism, that status quo to aspirational. There's a place right there where policy changes are made, and we have to grapple with those. So thank you for including me in this today. I think you are a fantastic congressman. I'm so thrilled that you were elected. I could not be happier that we have you representing us, and you are indefatigable. So you're everywhere, never tiring, traveling all over the country and your 2 counties in order to always be present in your community. And I'm really grateful for that. So thank you for your service, Congressman.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm so grateful for your service as well and for your incredibly thoughtful remarks. And we've just got so much work to do, and I'm grateful to have the chance to work together for a long time to come as well. For those who have watched these town halls before, they know that Dr. Karl Steinberg is just a fantastic local expert on so many of these issues that we're facing regarding COVID. And he is a hospice medical director. He works with many of our local skilled nursing facilities throughout North County. He earned his bachelor's degree from Harvard. I don't hold that against him too much. And went to the Ohio State University College of Medicine. Got to get that right. And then he completed his family medicine residency at UC San Diego. Go Tritons. Dr. Steinberg, I wanted to turn it over to you for an update on COVID-19.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's an honor to be on this panel with the rest of these great people and with you. Echo what Mayor Blakespear said. We're very fortunate to have such a great congressman. It's been kind of an emotional week. I also want to just recognize what happened to George Floyd, and just the people are at the end of their ropes. You know, it's like a perfect storm, and I totally understand the rage to the extent that a person who is white. I mean, I'm half Mexican actually, so I guess I'm partially of color, but I'm not black, and if I get pulled over because I'm a few miles an hour over the speed limit, I'm not afraid for my life. And I would love to see that change. I grew up, I spent the first 10 years of my life in Atlanta, Georgia. It was in the 1960s. And throughout my life, I felt like, things were really moving in the right direction. And I mean, I felt that way up until 3.5 years ago. And I'm very much a glass half full kind of guy. I like to see the best in people. When I get lemons, I like to make lemonade. And I truly hope that, as other people have said, that when we get through all this, and it won't be easy, that there will be some good things that come out of it. I would love to see some sweeping changes that make us feel like this world and our country are a little bit more human and equitable and so on. But anyway, that's really not related to COVID-19. But I do think, I hope we'll see some changes in, the environment may get better. I'd like to see more people be able to work from home and that sort of thing, and those sort of efficiencies. We've all learned how to wash our hands properly. And at the same time, it's disturbing some of the anti-science rhetoric that we hear. And I just encourage all of our constituents, everybody, before you pass something on that you see on social media, try to do a little fact checking. I mean, this whole thing about, wearing a mask being bad for your health, or that, that you're having your carbon dioxide levels are going up, or, I mean, there's just no evidence for that, right? Neurosurgeons wear these masks for 12-hour surgeries. There's no harm. And it's a shame that it's become a political issue. I think we're all about personal freedom, but there's a balancing act between your own personal liberties and public safety. So I see a lot of people that don't wear masks. People have a personal choice, but it hurts me to see that there's so much venom around this subject, in both directions, really. So just a little something about about COVID-19. Congressman mentioned what's going on in our counties, and I'll talk a little bit more about. There's been quite a few cases down by the border, and especially out in the Imperial Valley in El Centro, and so all the San Diego hospitals have chipped in to help take care of some of those people. But Orange County has had quite an increase in cases, and I'm a nursing home doctor, so I'll talk a little about nursing homes. You may be aware that over 40% of the deaths in our country from COVID have occurred in nursing homes and other, like assisted living facilities and so on. And that's hugely disproportionate. They make up about 0.5% of the population and 40% of the deaths. That's an 80-fold disproportionate death rate. Right now, San Diego County, thankfully, they've gotten to the point where they're doing testing of all nursing home residents and all staff, and that'll be done by the end of this month. And we've been very fortunate in North County. And in fact, in San Diego County, we've only had 150 deaths in nursing homes. There's been over 300, I believe, or around 300 in Orange County. But in any event, it disturbs me when I see all the press coverage about how bad nursing homes are and how, if only they had a disaster plan in place, this wouldn't have happened. The problem is not whether they have a disaster plan or not. I mean, that's a disaster plan is for when you have to evacuate somebody because of a fire or something. This problem that happened had to do with lack of PPE, masks and so on, and also lack of available testing. So thankfully, that's much less of a problem right now. But the people who work in nursing homes are great people. God bless them. And so to have them blamed and really some of the governmental agencies are just piling on. They're looking for a scapegoat. But in any event, things are relatively quiet in most of our nursing homes, and they're doing a very good job of, the heroes that are working there. So I think that's about all I have to say, and we probably should get to our questions because I know we have a lot of them.
Well, thank you as always, Doctor. And we do have a ton of questions. They really range from both the policy side as well as COVID-19. I'll start with a question from Robert, who says, I'm an African-American citizen and U.S. Navy veteran. I wanted to ask, with all the racial inequality and systematic injustice and police brutality against African-Americans, what are your plans as a member of Congress to help make changes to the racial inequality and systematic injustice and police brutality against African-Americans? Well, Robert, thank you so much for that question. I think first and foremost, I need to listen. That's what I've been trying to do this past week. That's what I'll continue to try to do in the weeks and months and years ahead as a member of Congress. And I don't pretend to have all the answers. I don't pretend to understand the pain. As Dr. Steinberg said, he and I actually have something else in common, which is that we're both half Mexican. My mom is Mexican American. My dad is Jewish American. And I just say I'm American. But I also, like Dr. Steinberg, have never had to suffer because of the color of my skin. And I recognize the extraordinary privilege that I've been able to have throughout my lifetime. And I also know from my friends and colleagues that things are far from fair, far from just in this country. And I think that COVID-19, unfortunately, along with the tragic events in Minneapolis, just brought many wounds to the surface that we have to address, and we have to address now. In terms of what Congress is going to do, as I mentioned, there are a number of efforts. My colleague from New York, Hakeem Jeffries, has a bill that would ban chokeholds at the federal level. I co-sponsored that. Other colleagues have other ideas. We'll be discussing those. The Judiciary Committee will be marking them up. And I have heard, I was just on a call with the speaker, a Zoom like this morning, and I expect we're going to be moving very quickly on a number of these initiatives in the coming days as we try to honor the legacy of George Floyd and match the moment that we are facing right now, which is hopefully an opportunity for us to work collectively to do some good. Now, I'm not encouraged by the Senate. Under Mitch McConnell, the Senate hasn't even passed the anti-lynching legislation that the House passed a few weeks ago on an overwhelming bipartisan vote. Literally only a couple members of the House voted against. I can't fathom that they did, but nonetheless, we sent that to the Senate, and the Senate won't even take that bill up. It really is a sad state of affairs, and we just have to keep pushing the Senate to take action, and we have to continue to push in the House to introduce and pass legislation that will help address the problem. But thank you very much for the question, and contact our office if you have any specific ideas or suggestions. Samantha has a medical question for you, doctor. Actually, no. Yes, it is. Well, it is a medical. It's both a medical question, but it's also addressed at me. Samantha says, I would like to know what specific actions Rep. Levin is taking to make sure the Black community in his district is receiving testing and access to health care at the same rate or higher than the wealthy white communities are in our district. Samantha, it's an outstanding question. Perhaps I'll address it from a policy level, and then Dr. Steinberg, you can talk about some of those disparities generally, if you'd like. Samantha, what I have seen, unfortunately, is in the first round and second round of funding for COVID-19 for testing specifically, we were too focused on Medicare reimbursement and not focused enough on Medicaid reimbursement. As an example, we've got Vista Community Clinic in our district. I think they have around 8 different community health centers in our district. They did not get the funding that they needed. And they also didn't receive any funding under the Paycheck Protection Program because they're too large. They're a nonprofit organization of around 700 employees. So we tried to rectify that, and we led an effort that scores of my colleagues signed up and eventually made it into the HEROES Act to focus instead on Medicaid reimbursement alongside Medicare. That will go a long way, I believe, to helping our community health centers and others who are serving underserved communities, communities of color in areas of our district and throughout, I hope, throughout the United States. So that is a big deal in terms of how that funding for testing and treatment will be allocated. The other thing in the HEROES Act, there's a huge amount of money for testing and treatment and contact tracing as well, and specific language in there that we've got to match the need in the different communities that are most at risk, that have the highest rates of infection, the highest rates of mortality. We have to match the need with the testing and treatment for those communities. And so language like that, I think, is really important. And when the Senate takes it up, we have to make sure that they include that language in that final proposal that'll be negotiated in the coming days and weeks. Dr. Steinberg, anything more about testing disparity?
No, I really don't have anything to add to that other than just to encourage our constituents, particularly those who are uninsured or underinsured and who, historically may not be very high utilizers of the healthcare system, is just don't ignore serious symptoms. If you have something going on, by all means, go get checked out. And I know that the community clinics are now, I believe, offering testing to appropriate people. So hopefully that disparity will be less.
And my hope is that specifically there's more testing of the asymptomatic workers and residents in nursing homes. I think we have to focus on that community given the statistics that you mentioned.
Yeah, that's happening. So that San Diego County is out doing it, right now today. I know they're over at Village Square doing testing. They've done most of the buildings in North County, 100% of the residents, and by the end of the month, 100% of the staff will be tested. And so far, we haven't picked up a lot of asymptomatic disease, but that it has been found in other parts of the state and in other states. So,
and the county is taking the initiative to do that.
Yes, they've been super helpful.
It'd be great if my other county would do that as well. I may have mentioned that to them a couple of times. Lisa asks, I would like to know what California is doing about travel restrictions of the states with no lockdown from coming to Hawaii or from coming to California and contaminating us. Will they have quarantine like Hawaii, temperature taking and testing? Well, currently, Lisa, California has no travel restrictions that I'm aware of from other states. But I think it all comes down to what we were just talking about, testing and contact tracing. So critically important that we're testing a sufficient number of people. And again, the Harvard, I'm not just saying Harvard because Dr. Steinberg's here. The Harvard model says 152 tests per 100,000 people per day actually administered. That means that in a community like ours that has San Diego, Orange counties both have over 3 million people, around 3.2 million people, they ought to be testing over 5,000 people per day per county. Right now, San Diego County is testing 4,000, 4,500, pretty close. Orange County, not so close, not doing as much. So that's what Harvard says we need to do. That's also what the state of California says that we need to do. And we need to make sure that that happens so that we have that public confidence again that we're going to be able to reopen. We all want the same thing. We all want to reopen. We just want to do so safely. Make sure that there's public health best practices being used. I think that's what everyone wants. No one wants to see businesses shut down. No one wants to see people out of work. We just want to make sure that when we reopen that we're safe when we do it. Duncan in Encinitas. Oh, I'm going to have to make sure the mayor weighs in on this. Duncan asks, I know it's stating the obvious, but we need much better civilian control of policing behavior. We watched Rodney King's violent police beating 30 years ago, and it feels like nothing has changed. Enough, enough, enough. What a joyous day it was when Barack Obama was elected as our first Black president. I soon got a big surprise when I discovered several of my other white friends were closet racists. Please let me know how we can begin to change this tragic reality. Well, thank you, Duncan. I remember very well 1992, went to high school in Los Angeles, and the Rodney King situation I had hoped would never be repeated again. But it's clear to me that we need new laws to strengthen transparency in law enforcement. We've got to, as I said, ban unnecessary and excessive uses of force. And there's just a ton more that we need to do. And listening is so important. Mayor Blakespear, since it's an Encinitas resident, I want to give you a shot to answer this.
Well, thank you. And I'll say I was similarly thrilled when President Obama was elected, and I just was watching him in the half an hour before this started because he was addressing us, the nation, and he's always hopeful, and I just love listening to him, and it's such a sadness that he's not our current president. I just want to say a couple things about the question. So police officers and sheriff, they are civilians. It's important to remember that because they are not military. So we have a civilian police force, and clearly we are starting to see a bleed between these two with all of the military equipment that's coming into local departments. And I'm hopeful that Congress can take action on that too, because we don't want to have a militarized local police force. Also, the city of Encinitas, our policing is done by the sheriff's department. There are 9 cities in the county that use the sheriff. And just today, I spent the vast majority of today drafting a letter to send to 50 elected officials in this county, those cities, those 9 cities in the county, asking the sheriff to do what the San Diego Police Department announced, which is that they are banning the carotid restraint and chokeholds. And so that's something that's very discreet, specific, disproportionately affects minorities, and has been adopted by larger departments throughout this country, larger police departments, and is something we could do here. The sheriff himself, Sheriff Gore, has said that he's not in favor of making any reform like that. And I think we need to be applying pressure for the contract cities that use him, 9 of them in this county. There are 18 total cities in San Diego County, that we say we want to see a responsiveness to the community. We want to ensure that what happened in Minneapolis never happens here. And I mean, as you know, the carotid is the vessel that allows you to breathe. So if you're constraining that, people are losing the ability to breathe, and bad things can happen really quickly. So it doesn't have to take 9 minutes. You can still have a lot of medical problems that happen from a bit much shorter time. So the fact that we haven't had that yet from that technique in this county, we don't want to wait for that to happen, right? We want to make the reforms in advance. So this is part of channeling that energy into specific asks, because if you're not saying something specific, then there's no accountability and nothing changes, and we can go back to what we've always been doing. So I'm hopeful that this will be able to make progress, but I also encourage us to continue to be really specific about what are the changes we want.
Thank you, Mayor. Steve, anything that you'd like to add?
No, you're kind to offer me that opportunity. Except that, I would just say, as sort of an outsider of your district, but another regional collaborator, I think we all know to follow on the mayor's comments. Building community trust is the key to modern policing, and our law enforcement are a civilian group, and they should behave accordingly. And in the 21st century, policing is all about partnership.
Thank you, Steve. Vincent in San Clemente has a medical question. Recently, with stay-at-home orders lifted in Orange County, my employer called me back knowing that I am caring for my 76-year-old father, who is immunocompromised and diabetic. I expressed to them my concerns and hesitations about returning to work right away, and they began using my unemployment benefits as leverage to pressure me into coming back. Am I going to have to choose between the well-being of my father and myself and my livelihood? Tough question. I certainly hope not. Dr. Steinberg, anything you'd like to mention there?
Yeah, thank you. Vincent, first of all, let me thank you for being a caregiver. That's hard work. It's often under-recognized. It's difficult and sometimes thankless. And I just want to acknowledge that you're doing that. Not everybody is fortunate enough to have brought up a child who has the ability to do that. So let me thank you. I'm also sorry for the situation that you find yourself in. And I think there are a lot of people who are going to be looking at these types of situations. I'd say it's a decision that you're going to ultimately have to make one way or the other. People who work in nursing homes, many of them have older or ill loved ones at home. Some of them have been put up in hotels after they, if they're working, especially in a facility that has COVID. But I mean, for a regular job, probably all I would say is if you go back to work, do the regular things that are going to help protect you, right? A lot of hand washing and, sanitizing surfaces, keeping distance as much as possible, wearing a mask if that's something that's feasible at work, which hopefully it is, especially right now. And then, when you get home, take your clothes off, shower, all that kind of thing. And don't let your clothing come in direct contact with your dad. And I think the risk of transmission to your dad is probably quite low. I don't know exactly what job you have, but anyway, I'm sorry you're looking at that situation. That's a tough choice. But people do have to work.
Well, one thing I would say, if you can't telework, if your health is compromised, if you're caring for a loved one who's vulnerable, then you ought to be able to remain on unemployment benefits for the time being. And our office would be happy to help you if you contact us, and we'll do everything we can to start a case or to refer you to the appropriate state agency, because that's just an unacceptable situation that you're in, and I'm so sorry to hear it. Johanna in Carlsbad says, thank you for your statements on the current protests and riots following the death of George Floyd. As a community member, I would like to hear what measures you're taking to condemn current police brutality and prevent any further needless violence. Additionally, I'm interested to hear what, if any, measures you are taking to hold other community members at the city, state, and/or federal level accountable for mitigating any existing and future violence between police forces and minority groups. Well, as I said before, Johanna, thank you for the question. And, it's an incredibly difficult time for our communities, and I'm trying to listen as best I can. I'm trying to listen to our community leaders, our faith leaders, our law enforcement as well, hoping to be a bridge builder to try to bring people together on some actual reform that will be meaningful in this very difficult time, trying to turn this time of crisis into something that hopefully will be a time of renewal. I think our community desperately needs healing right now. And that was before the events of the last week, before the events in Minneapolis and throughout the country. This was an incredibly difficult time. I have spoken with local law enforcement over the past week as well. And I have said that they need to be part of the solution. And my belief is that we can work together and we can get something done for the greater good. But I was very encouraged by what the city of San Diego chief did with regard to the carotid chokehold, as Mayor Blakespear referenced. And we just have to do everything we can. I will use my office. I know the council member and the mayor will use their offices as well. And I think we can come together and we can work on behalf of those who need our help the most and just continue to listen as best we can. And as I mentioned, if you have any specific recommendations or suggestions, call our office or contact our office. We'd be delighted to hear from you. Catherine in Rancho Santa Fe says you should be encouraging state leaders to open up the state. The virus was significant, but deaths contributed solely to COVID-19 were low. Well, I think that by and large, our counties working with our governor are trying to be responsible as we reopen so that we don't have a second wave of infection and death unnecessarily. As I said before, everybody wants the same thing. We all want to get to some new normal where we're able to open up businesses and get people back to work. We all want that. We just want to do so in a safe way where we're not putting public health at risk. And the more that we're not following the guidance of the federal government, the states, and our counties, the harder it's going to be. The better we do in following the guidance, wearing the masks, adhering to the social distancing, doing all the things we need to do as business owners with restaurants or with childcare or with whatever it may be, whatever type of business that we own, all those requirements, following those requirements, the more we can do that, the quicker it's going to be for us to be able to reopen without the second wave of infection. But those public health guidelines are there for a reason. They are there, and Steve Padilla can tell you why they're there, because this is not something that we can take lightly. This is an incredibly powerful virus, one that we do not have a treatment for yet that works, that we know consistently works. We do not have a vaccine that we know of yet. Hopefully we'll have one very soon. So we're not there. And we have to ramp up testing, tracing dramatically to the level that epidemiologists say we need. And we're not there yet either. Rate of infection in California, roughly flat. Hospitalization, roughly flat recently. Most states, it's going down. I saw a chart earlier today about 20 states, maybe less, maybe 15 states, it's flat. There are a handful of states where it's actually going up. So we have to make sure that we're through the worst of this. Dr. Steinberg, anything you'd like to add?
Well, I would echo what you said. And just as far as specific treatments, they're using remdesivir. We're getting a fair amount of it here in the county, and it's being used. It looks like for people who have not so severe cases, it definitely shortens the duration of the illness, kind of like the way Tamiflu might do for somebody with influenza A. And it's also, it seems to be somewhat beneficial for the more ill people, but it's definitely not a cure. And then using convalescent plasma also seems to be useful, but those are the closest things we have to a treatment right now. So, and I'm afraid we are going to probably have some kind of a second wave. I hope it's not too severe, but I think it'll be difficult to get around that.
And Steve, since I brought you up, you want to add any personal remarks to this?
I just would quickly just say that it's important to remember that it's an invisible enemy. It doesn't discriminate. And today, a lot of us in our community may be relieved by the fact that most of us are, going to clear this virus, not get infected, and if we do, not have symptoms and survive. But let's remember one thing. That's until our neighbor, our friend, our brother, our sister, our mother, or father are touched by this, or worse yet, made ill or worse. And one of the problems we face, in my view, as a survivor, is the constant challenge in that most Americans aren't touched by this personally still, even today. It's getting close. Unfortunately, the day is going to come when they are. And we shouldn't wait to be personally touched to recognize that this could mean the difference between life and death for someone. So while we may be in a good position right now individually, let's remember that our neighbors may not if we're irresponsible. And I would just make a plea to everyone as a survivor, whether you're touched by this or not, whether you know someone or not, remember that your actions could mean life or death for someone else, and we need to look after our community's health.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective, Steve. Bridget asks, who is responsible for choosing police chiefs who set the tone for training and discipline among the police? Bridget, it occurred to me that President Obama did a really good job of answering this question in his statement yesterday. So I'd like to read this to you. And I quote, the elected officials who matter most in reforming police departments and the criminal justice system work at the state and local levels. It's mayors and county executives that appoint most police chiefs and negotiate collective bargaining agreements with police unions. It's district attorneys and state's attorneys that decide whether or not to investigate and ultimately charge those involved in police misconduct. Those are all elected positions. In some places, police review boards with the power to monitor police conduct are elected as well. Unfortunately, voter turnout in these local races is usually pitifully low, especially among young people, which makes no sense given the direct impact these offices have on social justice issues. Not to mention the fact that who wins and who loses those seats is often determined by just a few thousand or even a few hundred votes. So the bottom line is this: if we want to bring about real change, then the choice isn't between protest and politics. We have to do both. End quote. He said it better than I could, so I will leave it at that. Mary in Dana Point says, I have adhered to the stay-at-home mandated by our governor since its inception on March 17, 2020. As a senior, I only go out for groceries armed with my mask, social distancing, and hand washing. I have remained healthy with no symptoms. Can I request a test to determine if I built up an immunity to the COVID-19 virus? Dr. Steinberg.
Yeah, well, Mary, first of all, I'm very glad that you have stayed healthy throughout this, and I'm glad that you've adhered to the recommendations to stay at home and do the proper social distancing and that. That's great. You can indeed request your doctor to order an antibody test, which I think is what you're asking about, to see if you're immune. I wouldn't really recommend it because I think the positive predictive value of that test is going to be extremely low because it's just almost vanishingly unlikely that you have had COVID. It's not zero, but it's close to zero. So, I mean, even if you had a test, it could be a false positive from some other coronavirus that you had years ago or something like that. The accuracy of these tests is not 100%. You also could go and have a test to see if you currently have it, if you're an asymptomatic carrier. And they are doing more of the sort of less invasive tests that don't involve, ramming that thing way up back almost into your brain, which for those of us that have had it, it's not fun. But in any event, you might check with your doctor. I just think at this point it would be a very low yield test, but the testing is much more readily available now, both antibody testing and antigen RNA testing, the swabs and whatnot.
Thank you for that, Doctor. Kelsey asks or says, hello, I'm a middle school science teacher in San Marcos. Education funding was just barely recovering from the last recession. And we know that California spends less on students than many states and has one of the highest student-teacher ratios in the country. What will our local government do to supplement the huge budget cuts to education at the state level? And I know we've got two great local government elected officials here. I can tell you that I am pushing very hard for more money for state and local government. And this is a big reason why when I talk to our superintendents all up and down our district, they are really hurting from the fiscal impact of COVID-19. But perhaps Mayor Blakespear and Councilmember Padilla, if you want to just talk about education for a minute and how this has impacted education.
Sure. One of the things that's really important to me as a working parent and representing thousands of working parents is that as things are reopening, that schools, the guidelines that govern schools are written in such a way that public schools can reopen. I think that we've seen a big push for like beaches to reopen, businesses to reopen, and the corresponding need for public schools to reopen is just as urgent. And I mean, the reason it's multifaceted, but kids are just simply not learning as well at home as they are in the public schools. the divide between the privileged and the not privileged will undoubtedly grow tremendously wider if they're out of school for longer, because certain families can afford tutors and an iPad for every kid and broadband, and other students, if it's a hybrid learning model, they'll be learning for a couple hours a day in the school, and then there will be no other formal instruction for those students. And then also, of course, it's just not realistic for parents like on a Zoom like this to then have to be managing a second grader, which my kids are older than that, but trying to oversee and manage them. I know those are about the age of your kids, Mike.
I have a second grader that I try to oversee
Yeah.
and manage from time to time. It's not easy. Not
Yeah.
easy.
So it's just not practical. And so with limited money, I do hope that there's more emphasis put on how to manage school from within a full-time on-campus environment, and less of it, it's going to be very limited. So less of it saying, let's buy every kid an iPad, because I think enabling this alternative model for some indefinite future of a year or two is a tremendous disservice to students and to parents and to the economy. We cannot reopen without schools. So the question was, are cities or local governments going to be funding schools? And I would say almost certainly not. Schools are funded through the state, and it goes through local school boards, and they manage that funding. They manage teachers. There are always parent associations like PTA, but cities, I mean, cities are doing things like, for example, funding homeless that they haven't done historically, because the county is supposed to fund homelessness. So to me, it seems like there are certain areas where there's some change happening, but I would not say that I'm seeing any indication that local cities will be funding schools. So you need to take those questions, really need to be taken up with state assembly member, state senator, and governor, because that's the area where school funding is really determined.
Thank you so much, Mayor, for that. Council member, anything you'd like to add?
I couldn't have said it better than the mayor. The mayor put it very
I agree. I agree. And, just again, I'm so grateful to all of our teachers, our superintendents, principals, that they've done a remarkably good job, in my mind, of having to transition very quickly into this distance learning model. And my wife and I have a 7-year-old, almost 8, who's in second grade, and we have a kindergartner who's 6. And my hat's off to their teachers. I'm just so incredibly grateful to them for being so adaptable and so invested. And I've never had more appreciation for our teachers and how difficult their job truly is than in the last 2.5 months, when I've had to try to get my 7-year-old son, and my wife often tries to get our 6-year-old daughter to do the work that they are assigned. Not always easy. So thank you to our teachers. Krista in Vista asks, our family has diligently followed distancing measures over the past months in order to keep ourselves and the community safe. I'm concerned with the rapid opening of our community. Specifically, my husband returning to an open office workplace where he's seated just a little over 6 feet from people and required to work with 100 plus people in one open room. For the past months, he successfully worked from home as a senior hardware engineer. He's been able to complete 95% of his job at home and has gone into the office to complete the other 5%. His company is now requiring everyone without underlying conditions or childcare issues to return without dividers between workspaces, without updating ventilation, and only asking people to use masks when not at their workstation. They have not staggered hours or arrival times either. Can you please help promote or require that businesses allow workers to telecommute if they can complete at least 90% of work from home? If teleworking is not feasible, can you please help with requiring workplaces to enforce masks at all times inside an open office space? There's a lot in there, Krista. I certainly agree that if people can telework and avoid gathering in closed spaces, then they should be given that ability. And in fact, we've seen some tech companies and others move toward allowing telework even for the rest of the year, or in some cases, even indefinitely. And I think the state and local government has to do all they can to continue to reinforce the basic health precautions that we all need to take. Dr. Steinberg, anything you'd like to add?
Nope, I don't.
Nope. Okay. Jolie asks, when will the mask mandate be lifted? Is it unfair to employees to be forced to wear masks for hours upon hours at a time at the cost of their own health? and to our constituents, boy, are you getting a sense of how we get people on both sides of an issue that call and comment. Doctor, when do you think the mask mandate will be lifted? Not putting you on the spot, but you'd be probably better at guessing than I would.
Yeah, I was going to say you'd probably be better at guessing than I would, but I mean,
say when we have a vaccine and people are actually immune.
Yeah, I mean, I think they may back off the mandate and make it more of a recommendation, and that may happen sometime in the next couple of months. And of course, that's different from one jurisdiction to the next. I think there's no question that wearing a mask reduces your risk of transmitting it to somebody else. It also reduces your risk of getting it from somebody else, even if it's just a cloth mask. And it reduces it a lot if you're wearing a medical mask or an N95. But I just want to, again, address this notion that somehow wearing a mask is unhealthy or hazardous to your health. That's not true. I mean, is it possible you might break out with a few zits on your face because you're sweating? Yes. Okay. But it's not actually dangerous to you. And, it's something that you're doing to protect the public, to protect other people and their loved ones and their precious elders and, grandparents and whatnot. So, I encourage you to just do it.
Well, and I am grateful. I want to give a shout out to my friend Louise, who in San Clemente, who's made more than, I think, around 5,000 or 6,000 homemade masks. Unbelievable. And has donated them. We took several hundred of them to the San Diego Food Bank, and incredible. And this weekend is Wear Orange, for those that don't know, for gun violence prevention. So I have my orange mask. I've got my American flag mask. My kids have their Paw Patrol masks. I mean, we do the best we can. Catherine in Oceanside asks, what is Representative Levin doing to help constituents who haven't received stimulus checks? I'm a disabled veteran with 4 dependents who has filed taxes for the past 2 years, is eligible, has my direct deposit information on record, and I still have not received stimulus money. Well, Catherine, the first thing I would recommend you do is call my office in Oceanside, and let's see if we can personally help you. It's 760-599-5000. Again, 760-599-5000. But I would also go to irs.gov, and my staff can help walk you through that. They have a Get My Payment tool, a portal that they've set up. Ask for some of your information, and we'll get to the bottom of what's going on. So let's definitely make sure that we're in touch. And for my staff that's watching, let's definitely make sure that we're in touch with Catherine in Oceanside. Hannah asks, what is the status of some form of the HEROES Act being passed by the Senate? Wouldn't I like to know, Hannah? That is a great question. What items will likely remain in the final version of the HEROES Act? Well, as of right now, Mitch McConnell in the Senate is refusing to do much of anything. You've got the chairman of the Fed, Jerome Powell. You've got Treasury Secretary Mnuchin. They have all said, look, we have to take action. And the other day I was watching a documentary on PBS of Franklin Roosevelt. And I think we're at a moment in our history, at a crossroads of great economic crisis. And we have to make a decision collectively as a country, as a government. Do we want to be more like Franklin Roosevelt or more like Herbert Hoover? And I know where I stand on that. And I think history will judge us either as dealing with this crisis with the level of support necessary to turn things around or not. And I think all of the modeling and the projections, there was just some recent reports that I saw this week, one from the Congressional Budget Office that said it's going to be many years before we get gross domestic product growth back to where it was pre-pandemic. Another that from the University of Chicago that said of the jobs, over 40 million jobs, people filing for unemployment in the last 2 months, only 42% of those jobs are expected to come back anytime soon. More and more you are hearing those saying we need to take action. And I am worried about the debt. I'm worried about a $4 trillion deficit this year. I'm worried about a debt that will reach $30 trillion if we continue on the course that we're on. I wish that over the last 3 years, pre-pandemic, this administration would not have added $3 trillion to our debt, but that's where we are. right now, we have to weigh the cost of action. We also have to weigh the cost of inaction. And I think the cost of inaction from all economists and Fed Chairman Powell and others that I have seen suggests that we better take bold steps to recover. That includes creating millions of jobs. I'd like to see infrastructure and public works be a big part of that, as it was as we recovered from the Great Depression. But thank you very much for the question. By the way, I'd like to see all the veterans-related provisions that I helped author in that final bill as well, and we're going to fight to make sure that happens, because those are very bipartisan efforts around things like veterans housing and veteran homelessness, veteran employment. We're going to fight very hard. Bill in San Clemente says, I had a pneumothorax. Oh, I didn't pronounce that very well. Collapsed lung 3 years ago. I'm wondering if I am more at risk from not being able to get off a ventilator if I'm infected with the COVID-19 virus. I'm in good health now, and I'm 72 years old. Dr. Steinberg.
Okay, well, if you had just a spontaneous pneumothorax where for no apparent reason you just dropped your lung, that means probably you would be more prone to having that happen a second time. It doesn't necessarily mean that you would be less likely to be able to get off the ventilator, although, you know, and I hate to say this, but you're 72, there's not a great chance you're going to get off the ventilator anyway if you land on a ventilator with COVID-19. In fact, Councilmember Padilla's statistics, even though he's a young, healthy guy, to get off the ventilator were, you know, less than 50%. So I'm so glad that you lived to tell the tale, and thanks for being here. But in any event, I think that just having a spontaneous pneumothorax doesn't mean you're less likely to get off the ventilator, but it does mean that because of the fact that with COVID-19, the pressures that we need to expand the lungs is a lot higher than it is with ordinary things that land you on a ventilator, like sepsis or something, or cardiac issues, that you'd be more likely to have another pneumothorax and require a chest tube and treatment for that.
Thank you, doctor. And we're just about out of time, but I did want to have this one last medical question for you from Julian in Dana Point, who says, during our public health crisis, anti-vaxxers have become increasingly aggressive and their movement is heavily funded. Apart from concerns that they may dissuade people from having the COVID-19 vaccination when it's developed and so compromise herd immunity, there are reports that with doctors' offices closed, children are not getting their routine MMR shots and boosters. Can you please remind people of the importance in terms of herd immunity of vaccinating a sufficient percentage of children against these devastating diseases, and give us your opinion as to the safety of MMR and other vaccinations?
Oh gosh, you know, maybe that's a question for a whole nother town hall. But let me just say, vaccines are real. Vaccines help. Vaccines are science. People who hate vaccines, I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but they are extremely rabid. And unfortunately, you know, it's just more of this anti-science business. And MMR is very safe. You know, if there's one vaccine I might, if I had kids, I might at least consider whether it's really, really necessary, is the HPV vaccine, you know, that prevents genital warts that can turn into cervical cancer or other types of genital cancers. But all of the childhood vaccines, they're safe. They have an extremely low serious side effect rate, and they clearly prevent disease. California has good, strong laws about those. And yes, it's true that right now a lot of doctors' offices have been closed. And unfortunately, a lot of doctors are choosing this as a time to retire. And I hope that we can have a decent primary care workforce when this is all over. But certainly, I would encourage everybody, if you're a little overdue on your vaccines, probably not a big thing, but do get your kid in there and get immunized. And I just found out I'm due for my booster for my Tdap, the tetanus, diphtheria, and pertussis. So I got to go get that one of these days.
Thank you, Dr. Steinberg. And we are now up against the 4 o'clock hour. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We decided to start a little late because President Obama started at 2, and we wanted to make sure that our viewers got a chance to see President Obama. But I wanted to, in Congress, we have the magic minute where members of Congress get 1 minute to say anything they like. And we have 3 great panelists, and I wanted to give you each 1 minute to say anything you like. And I'll start again with you, Councilmember Padilla.
Congressman, just thank you again for allowing me to participate in this amazing panel and for your leadership throughout the region.
That's, Steve, if you become a member of Congress, you can't end it in 20 seconds. I mean, that's the idea of the magic minute is usually takes members like 5 minutes. That's
a minute actually is 5 minutes. I'm just trying to beat the stereotype.
I'm just happy that you are well, my friend. It is so nice to see you, and I'm so grateful to you for your leadership and just for being an example out there. And just stay healthy, man. Really grateful.
Likewise, we have a lot to do.
We really do. Mayor Blakespear, your magic minute.
Yes, well, it's a similar. Thank you for the well-rounded information that your panelists provided today. It was great to participate, and I am hopeful about the future.
And if there are any residents of Encinitas that have not signed up for Mayor Blakespear's weekly email newsletter, they have to do that. How do they do that? What do they need to do?
That's a good question. Yes, they can go to mayorblakespear.com and they'll see a way to sign up just right there. It'll pop up.
Excellent. Thank you. So I read it. I learned from it. It's great. Everybody should subscribe. Even if you don't live in Encinitas, it's great.
Thank you.
Dr. Steinberg, the last word.
Yeah, I also just want to thank you for inviting me on here again. Thanks for all the great work you're doing on behalf of your constituents and beyond the district. And it was a pleasure to be on here with Councilmember Padilla and Mayor Blakespear. And I'm trying to maintain a positive attitude too. I hope we're going to see things change for the better. It's going to be a painful road that we have to walk down, but we're going to walk it together. And I'm just so glad that we have a lot of good people working on it. And please do stay healthy, everybody. Please be respectful of others. And, just remember that, we share that bond. We're all humans, and let's act that way, shall we? Thanks.
Well, thank you, Doctor, and thank you, Mayor Blakespear. Thank you, Councilmember Padilla. I hope this was informative. I hope that, again, everybody out there stays safe. Please follow the recommendations from the CDC as well as from the state of California and our counties. And it's just critical that we've come so far in practicing social distancing, following other health requirements. Let's make sure that we continue to follow the guidelines. Let's continue to stay the course. And so hopefully we can benefit from that by reopening as quickly as possible and as safely as possible, getting back to this new normal. And finally, I want to just close by expressing once again the racial inequality, the systemic injustice that we're dealing with and confronting as a society. It's been an incredibly painful time for so many in our community. I was grateful to see peaceful faces yesterday, at least half, because people were wearing their masks. I was grateful for that out in Cardiff. I look forward to seeing many more such peaceful events in the coming days and weeks where we also adhere to public health guidelines as we exercise our First Amendment rights, so critically important during this time. So with that, thank you all so much. It is always an honor to do these. I look forward to seeing you next week. Be safe and take care. Thank you.